I've made a ton of mistakes in my career. I've made decisions that later I had to pull back, and I've put tests in the market that didn't work out at all. And as I say to my children, it's okay to make a mistake, just don't make the same mistake twice. And I kind of hold myself to that same bar. Yeah.
Hey friends, welcome to Smart Venture Podcast, the best information for future CEOs. Starting a company is easy, but growing and managing it is hard. In this podcast, we sit down with the best founders, experienced leaders, and investors in tech and relevant space to give you the best tips to grow your company and grow yourself. Some of our most popular episodes are about crypto founders and investors. Check out our new podcast called Keeping Up with Crypto on YouTube, iTunes, and Spotify. If you like it, don't forget to subscribe and give it a 5-star. Hi, Olivia. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
Hi, Grace. It's lovely to be here. Thank you for having me.
When I was looking at your LinkedIn, it's like just so impressive. You've worked at all the iconic companies like McKinsey, Google, Dropbox. Now you're leading Notion. And I just want to say you're definitely kick ass. To start off the show, I would love to, hear a little bit more about like your perspective on how you got to where you are today.
Well, it's not one of those things that you plan out. And I always think when you look at people's LinkedIn, it doesn't kind of show all the bumps and bruises along the way. So don't be fooled. There are a lot of disappointments, a lot of times that, I thought I would maybe achieve something that I didn't, and all those things as well. So, I grew up, both my parents are immigrants, and I grew up in a world where, I had to make sure I would pay for college and have a job when I got out of college and pay for my own apartment and all of that. So I think it was something about that work ethic that I was raised with that at least gave me some strong foundation for kind of just pushing through some stuff that was harder earlier in my career.
Totally. So basically you, as you mentioned, like your drive's kind of coming from like the urge of like being independent as well as like just like sustain yourself. Curious, like early on, do you have like a role model or something in your life that kind of helped you to, I guess, like have the motivation to like be very excellent in your career?
I think honestly, it comes from the belief that my parents had in me and that my brother had in me. And I think it's very important as a mother. I think about that a lot. Of how do you raise children who are self-confident in what they can get done while at the same time being realist and, not overly confident. But that did help me a lot. My father definitely always told me that I could do whatever I wanted to do. And I think he very much felt that way because as an immigrant from Argentina, he felt like the United States was this magical place where if you worked hard, you could really do things versus where he had come from, which, has other challenges in a country like Argentina.
That's crazy. I think totally like as an immigrant, it definitely like motivates you to just like trying your best to like leverage all the opportunities in front of you. Curious, like, so later on, you've built a really great network for yourself from listening to your past podcasts. Like you mentioned, you heard about like Notion through a partner at CRO, and then you've worked with Diane Green from Google Cloud. And who do you consider as your personal board of advisors? And how do you kind of like build this kind of great network for yourself?
I've never actually thought of myself as a networker, to be totally honest. I kind of just put my head down and worked for a long time. I honestly think it's just, it turns out when, you work long enough that you just happen to know some people who just are wonderful people and are super helpful and have just done amazing things. So yeah, I'm super impressed by some of the folks who I was like an analyst with in McKinsey in New York. And now they're, doing these amazing things. I think it's more that than anything. Actually, the answer to your personal board of advisors, I think might be surprising. On this one, I was lucky enough to go to business school with some really amazing women. And as part of business school, they created these women in management groups. And then we actually, when we left Stanford, we ended up continuing that. And we merged a couple. And so there are 10 of us. And we have been meeting monthly every single month since 2004. And it's amazing. You just have these deep, deep friendships. you have these people who know you so well.
Mhm.
As you know, 1 month is going great, another month it's really hard, right? So they see all the ups and the downs. And like, if
Mhm.
one of them is going through an up, we're like, way to go, you're now a CEO and we love you and we're here for you. But at the next month, they weren't able to raise, and that's hard too, right? So I think by having that continuity and living those experiences so closely,
Mhm.
you're able to guide each other and support each other through the ups and downs.
Yeah, for sure. That's so great to hear. Like, I feel like definitely meeting with peers that you respect monthly and like having essentially like a support group. So you guys can grow together is like definitely extremely important. When it comes to like discovering your personal strength or like let's call it unfair advantage, like what do you consider as your like superpower in this case? And what are some skills that you're like constantly trying to get better at?
I don't actually think I have a superpower. I think I just love what I do. And so maybe that behaves or instantiates itself as a superpower, because you're just enjoying what you're doing and you get knocked down, but you're able to keep going because you know that you're building and you're having fun in the grand scheme of things.
Mhm.
So I would say that, it's always helpful to love what you're doing,
Mhm.
knowing of course that there'll be days when things are harder than others.
For sure. Like, so when you first come to Notion, what do you do on the first day to kind of like help you understand the product? And since you come from a lot of like really great companies, like compared to these different companies, like what do you think is something that you kind of like took from your past experience to this new job that you can, start, I guess, like building on this new platform?
Notion really is a special place. And I actually try to be very careful to not bring in, preconceptions from other experiences and somehow prevent that from listening and learning and all of that. So I really did spend my first 6 months and still listening, because it's an incredible business. I mean, the product market fit of Notion, I had nothing to do with. I only joined 10 months ago. It's just like a beautiful, beautiful product, and was built by Ivan and Simon. And it's just wonderful to be part of the team. And so for me, it's now like, how do I help build the team on the go-to-market side? How do I get just fantastic functional leaders in who feel supported, who feel like they can get the resources they need to do the job? And then, how do I make sure that failure modes that I've seen or witnessed or experiences that we don't repeat them here? I've made a ton of mistakes in my career. I've made decisions that later I had to pull back, and I've put tests in the market that didn't work out at all. And as I say to my children, it's okay to make a mistake, just don't make the same mistake twice. And I kind of hold myself to that same bar. Yeah.
Like I watch your talk at different conferences like Slash conference, and I saw that like basically you were mentioning like there's like a shift from like the go-to-market strategy, right? Like in the past, there was like a 3 generation of different strategies. At the beginning, it was, I guess, like we'll just talk about like what it is now at Notion. It seems like it's like a community-based strategy to go to market. Curious, like how do you guys come up with this strategy, as well as like what is the differences between like selling a product like 10 years ago to like now to maybe in the future?
Well, so I'll start historically and work my way forward. So 10 years ago in the world of SaaS, it was quite nascent actually. And the idea of a freemium model, hadn't totally taken hold. It was very early days, right? And I still remember when SaaS was even introduced, right? I was working at McKinsey, and it was like, here's the thing, there's this crazy concept that you pay by the drink or pay by the seat instead of, buying packaged software off the shelf, right? So obviously it's changed a lot over time. The way that folks used to sell was very much like, let's go find the decision maker and let's go talk to them about this product. And I think that's where obviously it then shifted to become, wow, if we just really make a fantastic product and we get the users to love the product, now we see a shift in the dynamic of decision making at these companies that actually users can influence that decision maker. And it's no longer the case that it's just this single top-down decision. And so community-led growth is an extension of that, right? Which is to say, yes, it's about the users. Turns out the users don't actually want to hear from the company itself. They value and trust much more the voice of other users, or what we call influencers. And so that's very much the path that Notion took, which is, one Instagram video about how amazing your product is going to go way farther than a blog that you write on your own website. And, you see that true today. Now, what you have to be careful of is there's a lot of noise out there, right? Because there is this like completely different way in which people engage with the world on digital platforms. And so you have to try to break through that noise. Right. And so how do you actually make sure that your message breaks through and that, you're able to have a narrative that's resonating? And I think that's really what Notion has been able to do because of the critical mass that it's been able to achieve in the number of users. And then because we have these ambassadors and champions and these multifaceted community, I do think that ends up being a pretty powerful tool for us.
Totally. When you're thinking about these kind of strategies, like how do you put them into like a measurable terms, right? Like, because I feel like sometimes like when I see a video, maybe I don't really take action until like maybe 6 months later or something. Like, I guess when we're talking about like community led like sales, or like there's a lot of like different videos on the internet, but curious, like how much of like the marketing budget goes to like, the community led marketing or like sales funnel versus like how much do you guys spend on like traditional type of marketing? And, or do you think like the community driven is like primarily that's like 100% compared to like, the former type of like, top down funnel, we spend this amount of money into like creating like these official commercials on the internet?
The important part about community is that it is all about relationships and it's all about trust. And so we don't actually spend a lot of money on community. We spend a lot of time on community. And I guess technically that translates into money because these are people who come to work every day at Notion. But really it's the time we spend with the community, right? So it's that back and forth discussion with our ambassadors. So they're telling us what they're hearing. We have ambassadors in all of our top countries. We're listening to what they have to say. We're taking it back to the product team. We tag it. We include it in the voice of the customer. We respond back to our ambassadors. Similarly, we spend that same time with our champions, right? We really try to have champions in all of our accounts. And we listen to what they have to say and we help them be successful within their own company, because many times they're viewed as kind of the chief Notion officer, right? And so it's really about the time we spend with that community and the trust that we have with that community. And that trust is, hey, we're going to share information with you. You're going to give us our perspectives back. We're either going to use it and tell you how we were able to fold it in, or we're going to explain to you why we're not able to deliver it yet or what other decisions we've made. So I think it's the two. It's the trust and the time that's really been important for us in terms of building our community.
Totally. When it comes to like product, do you feel like this, because of Notion is like a consumer type of product, so like the go-to-market strategy should be, like community based, or like do you feel like this is like a product specific way to develop your go-to-market strategy, or do you feel like this is like could be used for like multiple to be products, or like just like anything, it's like community based now?
I do think that it's applicable to different business models, not just one that bridges from a single player use case to a multiplayer use case, right? Which is where Notion finds itself, which is, yes, we have individuals using us potentially for personal reasons, but also potentially for work. And then we also have, teams or multiplayers engaging with us. And so, but we have community elements in both of those realms, right? Like we have folks who are engaging students, and we have folks who are engaging those individuals on those individual use cases. But similarly, then we have the champions in each of these companies. So we really try to bridge both. And I do think it's applicable across, but you really have to be honest with yourself about who's going to be your enthusiast, right? Like if you have a certain solution and you want XY executive to be the enthusiast, but actually the person who's going to get most excited about it is this other person, you really should lock in on them. Like you should invest in them, because actually they're going to be the ones that are going to be able to really be an extension of you and your brand and your solution.
Curious, like, so is this because of Notion was kind of like started very grassroots? Like, I've listened to your speeches, and then basically you were mentioning like Ben from like Notion at the beginning was a super like power user, and then like you guys were like you guys hired him to kind of like help run this community part of the business, and then he kind of like adding people into a Slack group and then started sharing strategies among these people. So it sounds like at the beginning in Notion's DNA, it was started that way, like in less a community business. So curious, like I think it's really tied to the current Web3 trends, right? Like every company or like companies slowly becoming DAOs. And curious, like when you are building a product or when we're trying to developing the first group of users, like what are some ways to kind of like find these power user, and at what degree do you kind of like incorporate them into your, I guess, like how do you implement this strategy from the beginning to gather your superpower user and kind of like slowly develop like a business strategy around it?
Yeah, and it's true. So Camille Ricketts was our first marketer over 3 years ago at Notion. I wasn't here. We just celebrated her 3 years. So really amazing. And she hired Ben, and Ben has done a tremendous job on community, and he hired Francisco, and Francisco similarly. So we really put, wonderful people, full-time people on this. And so we take it very seriously in that regard, and it's been a really important listening tool. And so to your question of then how do you programatize this? So as you think about, okay, well, how do I find that power user or that enthusiast? I do think that, if you kind of do pattern recognition off of what Ben and Camille and Francisco do, they are listening to the ecosystem, right? And they're seeing like, where is the chatter and who's it coming from? Right. And they follow that stream. They don't try to kind of artificially massage it or get it to be someone else. They literally just follow, who are these outspoken people and why are they so outspoken about this? Right. And really we're trying to stay honest to the things that got those people excited. Right. And building on that. And I think you definitely can do it with all different types of products if you're true to yourself and say, who are the ones that are getting most excited? In SaaS, obviously, you have the benefit where you can see usage, right? Like you can actually see who's in the product every day. And so when you're looking at a company and you're seeing like, wow, they're using Notion, that's great. We have a self-serve model. So, we wake up and we'll have enterprises using Notion and we've never spoken to them. And then we look like, who are the power users? And obviously we're not looking into any of the content or anything like that, but you can just see how many times are they leveraging Notion. And so you start to think about like, oh, that might be a great person to reach out to because they must find value in it. And so let's learn more about how they're able to access their value and what they're doing with our product.
Totally. When you first come into the business, like how do you analyze what is the business strength and then what is something that like the business should be, like I guess like adding more like attention to, like how do you kind of like, how do you, as a CRO, when you come in, like how do you run your department, like in a general sense? We don't have to go into detail if this is like sensitive or something.
No, not at all. I have two things that I use that I've learned over time. I definitely learned the hard way. One is like Maslow's hierarchy, right? Like you just look at the business and you see the different components of the business and you make sure that if you think about how much time you have in a month or how much time you have in a week, that you actually spend proportionate amount of time on the part that's driving the proportionate amount of business, right? And sometimes as an operator, you can get pulled into things that are noisiest, but actually you look at it and you're like, that's only 5% of the revenue. Why am I spending 70% of my time on it, right? So I've learned over time that I have to check, like I have to check, even resourcing wise, like, should we really be putting that many resources on this topic, right? Just because there are asks for it, is that actually going to make sense, right? So I would say that's number one, which is really thinking through like, what are the big drivers and am I proportionally spending enough time there? The second one is it's far better to find the things that are working and get them to just fly and scale them than it is to find the things that are broken and fix them. And I think that's a really important lesson I also learned after many, many mistakes, which is you can find like a lot of parts of the business that quote unquote aren't working. And you can spend nights and weekends trying to get them back to average. But actually, you're going to end up spending way more time on that than just taking the things that are working and accelerating them or expanding them.
I totally agree with you on like spending time matches with whatever, like you can get the most amount of results, right? Like, how do you evaluate like the new business lines? So like, I guess Notion is like a more mature set of business. Like, I don't really know if you guys have like new business lines all the time or like how it works within the business. But generally speaking, like, how do you budget your time to explore new revenue stream versus like how much time you spend on like, double down on things that's working?
Yeah, I mean, there's this concept of horizons, right? And so horizon 1 is the next 12 months. Horizon 2 is like the next, 12 to 24 months. And then horizon 3 is beyond. And what you do find is that if you always push off horizon 3, then by the time you need that to sustain your growth, it's way too late to be thinking about it, right? And so it does take time for things that you need to be incubating for a horizon 3 to take fruit. You need to be actually incubating them now. So I do try to be very thoughtful of that, right? Which is like, what is the thing that we're doing now over the next 12 months to hit like a very clear target? But then, I also hold myself accountable for thinking ahead and trying to play that chess game out a couple moves and saying, okay, but by the end of year 2, where do I also need to be? Right. And then I'm doing telemetry to see like, are we doing enough so that we have the exit velocity we need out of year 1 in order to hit what we need in year 2? Horizon 3 is slightly different in the sense that usually that includes like new products, new ways of monetization. And, we take that very seriously at Notion and we talk about it on a regular basis because we know that is very important and it needs bake time, right? So we can't push off that decision. We need to be making those decisions now.
When you are implementing some different strategies, when it comes to like meeting the near term or like long-term different horizons plan, like how do you kind of like budget the budget? Like, so do you feel like you spend like half of the maybe not Notion specifically, just curious, like in general, like how do you think of budgeting wise, like, or like, resources wise, like how much do you spend on developing the product? How much do you spend on like, the marketing sales funnel? And then like, how much do you spend on like human resources? How do you kind of like put together like an overall plan for the year?
I'll talk to the 2 components of that, which is one is for the year, but then how do you think about it against the horizons, right? I think the yearly budget has to reflect what you need to get done, right? So if you're early in your maturity curve and you're still very much building out product, and yes, you've hit product market fit, but you're going to have to still really build out that product, then your R&D budget should be, much greater than the rest of the budget, right? Which is the go-to-market side and G&A. And we try to think about that at Notion, right? We try to be cognizant of like, what is our scale limiter and are we putting the resources there? And then of course we'll put resources in the other place, but let's make sure to get that resource right. And then it does change over time, right? If you're a fully mature company, your portion that's R&D is going to be much smaller as a proportion. Right. But early days, what you do see is that, growth is paramount. And especially as someone who firmly believes in our mission, and that mission is to try to make everyone in the world tool makers and get our solution out to as many people as possible. We're not as focused on making sure that we're being hyper efficient, right? What we're trying to do is make sure we're moving as quickly as possible because we have a moment in time in the market window. And then that should change over time, right? I've also been part of more mature companies that have decided to become more cash plays, and that's the way in which they support their stock price. And then you think about that mix in terms of the functional spend very differently. I would say on the horizon perspective, you really need to invest in horizon 3 earlier than you think. And you need to have consistent investment. So I'll talk about a failure mode, right? Which is sometimes you see some of these startups, they get lightning in a bottle and the first go, right? Their act one is a hit. They, just have this thing that takes off. And then they expect everything else that they try to behave the same way. And when it doesn't, they shut it down, right? And as it turns out, it's actually very hard to find your act two and your act three. And you have to be patient and you have to give yourself enough time, right? And you can even look at a company like Google, right? Who obviously first had search, but then turned to YouTube, as I would say, act two from a monetization perspective. And then now is at Google Cloud, right? As like the next pillar of monetization and like substantial enough to actually be meaningful to the top line. But you can see tons of bets along the way, but you have to give it enough bake time to see whether that thing can actually take off.
Totally. I'm curious, if you're me, I guess like if you're running this business, like how do you pick what to do next?
Well, first of all, you've done an amazing job. So
you've done way more amazing job.
I'm not sure I'm the one to give you advice, but I can try to kind of at least frame how I would think about it. And so I would probably spend about 20% of my time, which is one day a week, trying new things, right? But not too many new things, but also not just one new thing, because then if that doesn't work out, you don't have enough lines in the water, to use like a fishing analogy. And so like, are there, 2 or 3 things that you can be having on boil on the stove and having conversations about? And some of these seem to get traction and some don't. And if they don't get traction, and if one gets more traction than the other, just then lean into that one, right? And try to take that one as far as you can and give yourself a 6-month cadence to say, okay, did that get enough traction? And if yes, okay, now I'm going to take it to the next stage, right? Or do I go back and put another line in the water? I'm sure you have a good feel for how this rolls out.
Like, I love what you just said. I'm curious, like, how do you think of, I think you're very experienced and you have like amazing things on your resume. I'm curious, like, what does it take to work with someone like you, right? Like there's a lot of like startup founders that are listening to this podcast. Like they're really trying to convince like the top talents to join. And you are someone that's like, definitely, I think like every listener would love to work with. Curious, like, what does it take to work with someone like you, and how do you evaluate these like career decisions when it comes to, which company to join?
Well, I don't know if it's me specific, but I can tell you how I thought about it. For me, it was all about the founder, and the founding team. And in this case, that was Ivan and Simon and Akshay. So Ivan and Simon were very much the team that did the product and really launched Notion. And then Akshay came in and really helped on the business side. And when I met with them, I was struck by how thoughtful they were and how much they listened and were really in this amazing way of interaction where you could just talk through something and it was like there was no defensiveness, there were no preconceptions. It was just literally like everyone was humble and everyone was just there to figure out what the best answer was and what the right answer for Notion was. And you need that kind of partnership because you don't know what you're going to hit as you scale, and you're definitely going to make mistakes. But you definitely want to be able to ask each other questions and think through things. And there's this quality at Notion that we call, one of our values is kind but direct. And for me, that was the most important because that leads to trust. And trust is the most important part of actually going into a relationship of building a company, right? Now, I just head up the go-to-market side. I'm not responsible for the whole company, but I always wear my company hat on when I'm making decisions. And so I very much value being able to talk through things very, very openly with those set of leaders. And then I looked at the executive team, which was also fantastic. And it's just a great team to work with. Yeah. And then, the product has to speak to you. For me, it matters a lot. Like I really do believe in the mission, this mission of kind of enabling anyone to create a tool that works for them, even if you don't code, was really spoke to me. I think I love the Valley, but if you're not an engineer in the Valley, sometimes you feel that. And if I can be part of just giving people the joy of like basically creating software flows on their own, that's pretty awesome. And it's just amazing what Ivan and Simon built.
Totally. I think that's really beautiful. And I feel like Notion is such a really interesting product because of it seems so simple, but like you said, like it is kind of everyone can create their own software in a way to build upon like the existing template or the existing functions. Curious, like, so you serve in so many different positions. So like you worked in go to market, you worked in operation, you worked in consulting. I guess like what are something that's kind of in common in your like in all of these positions, and how do you, I guess, like build up your soft skill set, because you seems like a really nice person to work with, and curious like how do you improve your soft skill?
So the things that they all have in common is tech. I do love
Okay.
tech. Just to solve the riddle for you. It's a super challenging environment. I like it, keeps me on my toes. I just love it. I mean, I think soft skills are constant. Like I'm always working on myself. I'm always working on my soft skills. The way you interacted and gave feedback or, operated and did things when I was in a consulting environment was then very different when I got to Google, right? And actually that was one of the hardest things that I found, which was when I got to Google, I had to like legitimately lead teams and they had to want to be on your team. You weren't just assigning out projects. And any one of those people were incredibly gifted and could have gotten a job anywhere else. And so like you literally had to get them to be excited to work not only at Google, but on your team at Google. So that was a real that takes time to learn. And I feel like I'm constantly, I have a coach. I always meet with my coach. There's always something to talk about. There's always something I can do better. Because especially as your environments change, the way you navigate that changes, right? So different environments require you to have different soft skills, frankly, different people who you interact with, right? Like some people like to be given advice or counsel in one way, and some people actually will only hear it if it's in another way. And kind of learning all of that, I think is ongoing. And then I think you just also have to work on yourself. I mean, right. So early on in my career, even though I said that my parents instilled a sense of confidence, it's not like at work every day I was like, oh, I'm crushing it, right? I mean, I was fighting constantly, like, am I doing well enough? Am I working hard enough? Am I doing what it takes? And I think now, where I'm at is kind of like, I think less about how I am doing, right, from an achievement perspective. And I think much more about, is the thing I'm building growing, or is the team I'm building growing? And me as a person is less in the picture. And that's been a journey for me. It's like a more of a place of calm, I would say.
Totally. Like you seem super positive, and then in general, like seems like a positive vibe like person. I'm curious, like what do you talk about like when you're like meeting up with executive coach, and like do they have to be really successful to coach someone like you, because you're pretty successful? So
I always have something to talk to my coach about. I mean, there's always something where you're trying to think about a situation that you're going into. You need to give someone feedback. You're trying to think through like, what's the best way they're going to receive this feedback? Or, hey, I'm thinking about how to structure my team. Here are the pros, here are the cons. So that stuff, I just love a sounding board. Not everyone is like that, by the way. Like I know people who, are their own counsel, right? But I am an extrovert in that way, that I like to kind of really think about things and have people push me on my thinking.
Totally. When it comes to like content diet, like how do you kind of keep yourself sharp? Like what do you consume every day? Do you listen to podcasts? Do you like read newspaper? How do you kind of like keep yourself informed?
I try to intentionally balance this, to be honest. I definitely was at a point in my life where all I did was read tech all day long, and what's the latest, who got this, and what investment, and who went public, and who bought whom, and all of that. And I did find that actually part of showing up as a good balanced person at work was of like actually getting a mix, right? And so often at night, what you'll find me reading is like a book to my kids.
Mhm.
Right now I'm reading a book with my daughter. This is like the cities of the world, and we read through 5 cities every night. It has nothing to do with tech, but then I wake up and I read, whatever are the blogs that I'm following or the channels that I'm following. So I just stay on top of things, but I do try to purposely step out of tech as well, just to provide a balance. I also feel like there are great learnings in how you make decisions and how you are a leader in history. And I love reading history for that very reason. And I think it grounds you, and like, the world does not revolve around Silicon Valley. And it's healthy, to know that, and to know that there's much bigger forces at work out there. And I think it keeps you grounded.
For sure. I think like history are like always like good to like, it kind of like opens your eyes on like, there's a lot of like problem that exists like from a long time ago, and then it just like repeats itself, and then like how you solve it. It's definitely great inspirations for like any person who's working on something, or like just in general fun to read. I'm curious, like, what is like a typical day for you? Because, you're also on the board of another company. Like, how do you kind of like structure your day?
So it just so happens this morning I had a board meeting. So this is like an unusual day, but usually my kids wake me up at 7 by crawling in my bed and cuddling with me. And then I take my kids to school. And then I jump on a phone call as I commute up to the Mission in San Francisco, which is where our offices are. And then I spend all day. We do a lot of hiring at Notion. So I actually usually spend about a third to half of my day doing interviews, because part of building Notion is just bringing in great people. And then spend a lot of time with each of the functions, again trying to calibrate, right? Like, am I spending my time on the most important things? And try to be home every day by 7:30 to have dinner with the family. And usually then about 10 I log in for another hour and go to bed.
That's so sweet. I love that you started with like, your children crawling into your bed, and like, it's just like, sounds like a really sweet day. When it comes to hiring, like, what do you look for in the candidates? Like, do you have, I guess like you chat a little bit about like this subject in like 20 VC, and curious, like when it comes to hiring, like, do you filter out the person first, or like, do you filter out like if they can do a certain type of work first?
So I really am most focused on the person. And I say that actually because, they're fantastic functional leaders at Notion, right? Like, we have a fantastic leader of customer support, and we have fantastic leaders in each of our regional sales areas and all of that, right? So I assume actually by the time the person comes to me that there's been enough due diligence and pressure testing on, does this person know their craft? And so then what I'm looking for is, really, do the values of this person align with what we're trying to get done as a company, and who we perceive and how we hold values ourselves, right? And so we have a certain set of values at Notion, and we really try to think deeply about the people who resonate with those values. And we know that as we get bigger and bigger, right, that obviously more people introduces more complexity, but we really are looking for people who, as I said, can be kind but honest, truly are owners of the mission, can be pace setters, right? These values we hold very dear.
What type of people would you, or like what type of position would you hire, like the young and ambitious people versus like the super experienced people? Because I think like, like just curious, like when it comes to like structuring the team, like which part do you feel like you can take a risk, take a chance, and then like kind of train someone, but there's like a risk that they wouldn't be really trained, or like they wouldn't be like, I guess like picking up the skill, or like they wouldn't be able to handling it, or like they just leave after you train them. How do you kind of like structuring in terms of like hiring?
It definitely needs to be a mix, right? And even the person that happens to have a ton of experience, then what you end up testing them for is, are they flexible in their thinking, right? Because what you want to make sure doesn't happen is like, oh, I'm coming from XYZ company and I did it this way. And as long as I can do it this way, again, I can guarantee you success. But if you ask me to do anything different, it won't work out. So yeah, we really do look for flexibility in thinking, first principles problem solving, and then demonstration of grit, right? Like have they hit challenges in their career and still been able to push through? Have they been scrappy about how to overcome roadblocks? Have they really been expansive in their thinking about how to get things done? I think that's the most important part. You can be highly experienced, but if you can only do it in a certain way, or you always have a reason as to why it's not going to be possible, then, it just makes it very hard to build and grow.
Totally. When you were thinking about like how to kind of like keep people stay in your company after you invest in them, either from your time, like time wise, or like you invest in like training them, how do you kind of like make sure that they stay? Because, like right now, we're in like a remote work era. So since everyone's like remote, so like people have more options to work in like somewhere else. So curious, like how do you make sure that they just like not leave after you spend time training them?
Well, there's two things. I think people really do care about the mission of companies and what the company stands for and what the company is trying to get done. And so I think a company that states their mission and stays true to that mission, that is going to have a higher chance of retaining people, so that when they come, the promise is actually that, right? Like, yes, this is our mission and we actually live our values. I think that has a lot to do with it. The other part is it really is a lot about relationships, and I think there is much more opportunity to form relationships than kind of like a remote world would suggest, right? And when I say that, I mean like when I was at Dropbox and a month in, there was a global shutdown. I still, like 6 months later, when we kind of vaguely understood now what was happening and all of that, I would still go on walks with people on my team, right? Like we were outside, we were wearing masks, but boy, did that make a difference, right? And it was completely worth it to block out 4 hours of my day to be able to do a 1.5 hour walk, drive to Stinson, or, drive to Christie Fields in San Francisco and go on a walk. That was way more valuable than trying to make sure that I could slot in like 4 back-to-back 1 hour calls, right? And so I think the more people can do that, the better, even if it means like, yes, I live in another place, but once a quarter I come in and do that and go on a walk with someone. I think that still continues to be important, because at the end of the day, you're working with these people. And so the relationship really, really matters.
Totally. I think like it's always good to like have some sort of like offset or like in person mixed in to make sure that like everyone is able to like, I guess like physically be present to each other, like kind of like build a different layer of relationship. So curious, like we chat a little bit about like, notions like go-to-market strategy is sort of like really community based. I'm curious, like what's your thought on the new culture of community building? What do you think like makes a good community, and how do you guys like kind of intentionally curate this group, besides like, having some thought leaders in the space? How do you kind of like create a really good community for your product?
We actually intentionally don't curate. And I think that is what makes it genuine, and why these communities are so vibrant is because they know that no one's there kind of curating their voice. And so if you look at our subreddit with over 160,000 followers, right? Like we are not curating that subreddit. If you look at our Facebook groups that exist out there, all those things, we are not trying to curate that. However, we are members, right? So if someone asks a question or makes a complaint or all of that stuff, like we're there listening. But if someone complains, we're never defensive and saying like, this is why you're wrong, right? So I think that is how we think about community, that we are an equal member of that community and that we are there to listen and share information if that's what's going to be helpful, but never to try to dictate a certain set of discussions or a certain narrative within that community. So I think that's one. The second is, it was really this great combination between the founders themselves. So Ivan, Simon, and Akshay on the business side, they themselves were engaging with these enthusiasts, right? Like they were going into a city and saying like, hey, who wants to meet up for a coffee chat, right? So they were role modeling that. And frankly, these folks were flocking in to go spend time with them and give them feedback on the product. And then by extension, there were ambassadors and all of that. So I don't think it can be this like, team that sits over here that lives community on behalf of the company, right? It has to be very much led by the founders and led by the key role models within the company that shows that like, this is really our ethos. And this is really how we think about all of you, that you're peers of ours and that we want to hear from you so that we can do better for you.
Totally. Okay, so we're at 1 minute fire round for you. So like number one is like, what's your favorite book?
Oh, my favorite book, A Man Called Intrepid. It's about the founding of the British intelligence service. And it's just like the scrappiness and the creativity that they had during a very tough time in history.
Wow, I'm totally gonna check it out. So who made the biggest impact in your career?
I think someone named Tom Stevenson. He always gave me tough love. He gave me the feedback that you don't want to hear, but you have to hear it if you want to get better and be better. And I think sometimes people don't want to go through the extra effort or frankly may put themselves in a vulnerable spot to give you feedback that might be hard to hear. And Tom just reliably, it's like, I love you like a sister, but I got to tell you, and I kind of like brace myself and I take it and I'm like, okay, and it's not fun, but you would hear it. I would hear it. And he did it in a way where I would hear it. And I knew that he cared about me. And so, I would say Tom.
I mean, how do you receive these like negative feedbacks? I always wanted to ask, but I'm always like, oh, what if like this is something that I'm actually insecure about? Like, how do you kind of like take these negative feedback?
I mean, it's never easy. I do think like in consulting, you got feedback every 6 months and it was up or out. So it's not only that you got the feedback, but then it was determined whether you would stay or whether you would go. So it was pretty intense. And so I think you also learn to take the full picture of it, right? Which is like, okay, here are the things that are going well. Here are the things I need to work on. In the grand scheme of things, are the things I'm going to need to work on so problematic that I should be like changing careers or something like that? And if the answer is no, well, then that's okay. Then you're just going to be better at what you do, right? But I do think the way in which people give it, and frankly, like I try to be very thoughtful of like the most important thing that I want the person to feel is that I deeply care about them and I deeply care about the journey they're on, right? And no one's perfect, right? So let's just have the conversation of like what's working and what's not and how I can help.
For sure. Why do you stay in McKinsey for 14 years? I think it's impressive. And then, as you mentioned, it's very stressful, right? Like every 6 months, there's some sort of feedback cycle. Like, and then with your credential, I feel like you can pick whatever you do, right? Like curious, like why do you decided to stay for so long?
It really is a pretty awesome learning environment. I mean, it's tough, but it's also, I found it anyway to be amazing learnings, like because you're getting exposed to different business problems, you're getting exposed to different industries, you're getting exposed to different executives and different leadership styles. And it's like, you're literally like a kid in a candy store if you love business. So that's how I had, I actually, the reason that I left McKinsey was I felt like my learning curve was plateauing a bit in the areas that I wanted to be learning. Like I realized I really wanted to learn how to operate. And then after 4 years of being a partner, I realized actually this isn't gonna get me that. And so I kind of kicked myself out of the nest.
How do you think people can recreate this like learning journey? It sounds like a really amazing journey. So
I don't know. I mean, my father's a scientist and he always raised me to say, the most important part of you is your brain. In fact, when I was a kid and I was like doing heading in soccer, he'd pull me aside, like, no headers for you, and so like, I definitely was raised to think about like, how are you feeding your brain? Like the second you stop learning is kind of the second you stop living. And I don't mean to be dramatic about that, but there is something to that, right? There truly is something to that. And so, a week where I learned something new or learned something different is just great.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Lovely to chat with you, Grace. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode. If you enjoyed today's episode, please hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out. Have a wonderful day.